Hi, I'm author and publisher Mark David Welsh and welcome to No Book Left Behind. And today we're delving into the frightening world of Hammer horror and the movie tie-in novelisation of Brides of Dracula. Today we'll be looking at The Brides of Dracula by Dean Owen. This was the movie tie-in novelisation of the 1960 Hammer film, which was their follow-up to the original Dracula made in 1958 with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, which is of course much better known in America as The Horror of Dracula. Our story begins with the newly qualified Marianne Danielle taking a coach journey on the way to assuming her position as a teacher at a private girls' school in a remote town called Badstein. As they travel through the mountains, a terrific storm breaks and she ends up with an unexpected and very unwelcome travelling companion in the form of a sinister man named Latour. Eventually they reach the comparative safety of the Running Boar Inn, where Latour secretly arranges for her to be abandoned. She's apparently rescued by a noblewoman, the Baroness Meinster, who turns up at the inn and invites Marianne to spend the night at her castle. She agrees, and sometime after they leave, another stranger arrives, summoned by a letter from the local priest, and this is the famous vampire hunter Van Helsing. Now, if you've seen the film, you're probably fairly familiar with that setup. But some context here, because this novelisation by Dean Owen is not a straight transcription of the movie. It's based on the original shooting script by regular Hammer screenwriter Jimmy Sangster. But that shooting script was not even Sangster's original concept for the story. That was called Disciple of Dracula. Now, it did feature Baron Meinster as the main vampire, and the hero was apparently going to be Latour. And in that original version of the story, Latour actually summons Count Dracula to deal with Meinster. And the idea was that Christopher Lee would reprise his role as Dracula from 2 years earlier. Now, there are various stories floating around about why Lee never signed on for the project and his participation was dropped fairly quickly. It could have been money, it might have been that he just did not want to do it because he was afraid of being typecast. Who knows? But writer Peter Bryan was brought in to retool Sangster's original script. And he was the one who brought Van Helsing back to the story, and Peter Cushing signed on to play him again. He also shifted Latour from the role of the hero into that of Meinster's private manservant / hired killer. He also included a couple of story elements that were eventually dropped but did turn up in 1964 in the Hammer film Kiss of the Vampire. Then it would seem the project was passed back into the hands of Sangster, who finally came up with this shooting script which the novel is based on. However, subsequent to that, there was a large amount of rewriting apparently done during filming by producer Anthony Hines and director Terence Fisher. And there's also a writer called Edward Percy who is credited. So he obviously had some input somewhere during this fairly chaotic process. At least that's my rough understanding of the genesis of how the script worked out. If you know any better, please don't be afraid to correct me in the comments below. I would welcome it. Having got all that out of the way, well, what's the book like? Well, it is significantly different from the film we finally got, and that's what makes it so interesting. The most obvious difference involves our old friend Latour, whose role in the story gets diminished so much in the film that he even loses his character's name. In fact, it's an uncredited role, which you normally see listed as the Man in Black. If you're familiar with the film and you'll cast your mind back to it, you might remember a sinister figure that's hanging around the inn at the start of the movie, and he's the man who bribes the coachman so that Marianne is left marooned there. Well, that is Latour, or what remains of him from the earlier versions of the script. And then he's never seen again. But in the book, he's acting as the Baroness's right-hand man. and he's far more involved in the action, even going hand to hand with Van Helsing on a couple of occasions when he tries to kill him. And that brings up some interesting news about Van Helsing. This version of the character is far more Hugh Jackman than Peter Cushing. He could reasonably be labelled as an action hero. Not only does he mix it with Latour and with Baron Meinster, but he also takes on a mob of torch-bearing villagers at one point. And as well as these fight scenes, he falls in love with Marianne, and the two of them enjoy a sex scene together. Yes, Van Helsing gets laid. I'm not sure what dear Peter would have made of that. Needless to say, most of that didn't make it into the final film. But its absence does explain one of the more unconvincing aspects of the movie, specifically the love affair between Baron Meinster and Marianne, which happens ridiculously fast, even given a knowledge of Meinster's hypnotic powers. There's also a very awkward moment when Marianne seems very surprised when the Baron announces that his mother was dead. And it's awkward because a few scenes before she's seen the woman's corpse. I guess it's difficult to avoid those kind of continuity gaps when you're trying to write on the fly during filming. The book also makes several attempts to add to vampire lore, and these are a little odd but certainly interesting. There's frequent mentions of the first full moon of spring, with it being inferred quite heavily that this is a time when vampires become active again. I never realised they hibernated for the winter, but perhaps they do. Most interesting is the references to an off-screen vampire hierarchy and their behavioural rules for the undead. Apparently, by taking his own mother's blood, Meinster has broken one of these unholy covenants, and he's punished at the end of the book when he's attacked by a swarm of vampires. A sequence which does not appear in the film but was resurrected 4 years later for Kiss of the Vampire. And talking of the ending, spoiler alert for a movie more than 60 years old, both book and film share Van Helsing's use of the sails of the windmill to cast the shadow of a cross on the ground which incinerates Meinster. However, I've always had a little bit of a problem with this, and that plays into something more general. You see, it's a great visual. I don't actually have any problem with it as the ending of the movie. I think it's brilliant. But it doesn't make a lot of sense, really, does it? I mean, I can see why vampires are repelled by the crucifix. It's a symbol of Christianity, of divine power, and they are agents of the devil. I can also see why they've got a problem with holy water. That makes perfect sense. But these items have been sanctified by the church. I can't really think that the sails of a windmill have been blessed by the local priest. And it is just a shadow of a shape on the ground. Now, when did just the shape of the cross become sufficient to bother a vampire? I seem to recall Cushing using crossed candlesticks against Lee at the end of the previous film. But whether that was the first instance of it, I'm not sure. Of course, some people have argued that it's the faith of the wielder that is sufficient to repel the vampire. But if that's the case, then why do you need to make the shape at all? I can only hope that I never run into a vampire when I'm on my way home late one night. Now, leaving the movie aside for a moment, what's the book like as a piece of vampire literature? Well, it's certainly a quick and breezy read. Dean Owen was one of the many pseudonyms of a writer called Dudley Dean McGaughey, who wrote many other movie tie-in novelisations around this point. I think it's fair to say that he doesn't overburden himself with making a great effort to create any kind of tangible gothic atmosphere, expand the characters, or do anything really more than just transcribe the original script that he was given. But then that was probably the assignment, and I guess he was under a deadline to deliver it. It's undeniably a fun read, and I couldn't help wishing that Hammer had had the time, the inclination, maybe the money, to make the film as written in the book, or at least include some of these ideas, because I think it creates a more fully realised story than the one we ended up getting, much as I do love the film. However, I don't think that was ever likely to happen, because to get everything from the book onto the screen would have meant a running time probably of around 2 hours, I would think. And the longest movie that Hammer ever delivered was Quatermass and the Pit, which clocked in, I think, about 97 minutes. 2 hours weren't really their thing. Now, one word about this particular edition of the novel. I'm sorry to report there are rather a lot of typos in here. So much so that sometimes I found it difficult to understand the meaning of a particular sentence until I read it back a couple of times. I mean, my favourite was when they used the word fumbling to describe the sound of the wheels of an approaching carriage instead of the word rumbling. But if you're a Hammer fan, I'm sure you'll enjoy this. You should check it out. And even if you're not actually a particular Hammer aficionado, but just a fan of vampire literature in general, you should probably get something from it, I would think, even if it does feel a little bit like a throwaway at times. So those are my thoughts on Brides of Dracula. Have you read the book? Have you seen the movie? Which did you prefer? Are there any other movie tie-in novelisations you'd like me to cover on this channel? Please put your suggestions in the comments below. They're most welcome. After all, it's a whole type of literature which generally seems to have been forgotten, and that's kind of my thing. So thank you very much for staying with me till the end of the video. I'd also appreciate you pushing the like button, of course, and why not subscribe to hear more of me talking about obscure and forgotten literature. You could join my Patreon, but I ain't got one, so that's not really worth doing. But anyway, in the meantime, keep on digging for forgotten books, because there are some treasures out there just waiting to be found. Dean Owen was actually a pseudonym, one of many pseudonyms, of a writer called Dean... Oh, I've forgotten his name. Dean Dudley. Dudley Dean. Shit. Dean Owen was one of many pseudonyms of a writer called... I keep forgetting his name. Dudley Dean. Dudley Dean. Christ. Bastard.